So tonight I wanted to open up with a review of what we went over last Tuesday, looking at patterns and sequencing, because I got some feedback and some questions, and so I wanted to review that so there would not be any kind of confusion, because this was a beautiful layout that Charlene did to help us see the patterns and sequencing in the book of Daniel that I had never seen before. But the question came in that was posed to me from several sources, not a whole bunch, but they wondered why the bottom section was mainly Rome, 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 Rome. And so I wanted us to understand that this pattern was, number one, to show us the pattern and the sequencing. And we know that Rome and papal supremacy is most definitely a huge part of the conglomerate beast of the end times. I do want us to remember that, again, this section is teaching us about structure, but we are very much aware that the latter kingdoms are partly iron in the feet, partly clay in the feet, and the 10 toes are a mixture of iron and clay. In the date range for the legs of iron, we have the dates from 168 BC to AD 476. So I also, wanted to talk about, Rome. I wanted to talk about the conglomerate beast. And what came to me was using the acronym Rome, R period, O period, M period, E period, to help us also be mindful of this conglomerate beast that we touched on briefly in Revelation 13 last week. So if we use Rome as an acronym, it will help us be mindful of that, because the conglomerate beast in Revelation is like a chimera. It's a mixture, if you will, of all kinds of animals, and so in a way it's a mixing of DNA, all kinds of mixtures. So as we continue our Daniel study, our focus for Daniel, as we use the book Daniel, Understanding the Dreams and Visions, is mainly going to be on Rome and the papal supremacy, and it's going to give us a wealth of history that I am so looking forward to, okay? But along in history, as we all know, there's several lines of history running parallel with us. And I want us to be mindful that anytime we're studying eschatology, that in itself is one of those topics that, is in that double-minded section, if you will. There's, you'll hear, well, that's not what I think. Well, this is what I think. And that is perfectly okay, because we are all on our own individual sanctification process, and His Ruach HaKodesh is leading us to all truth. Now, there's only one answer in His Word, because Yahweh is not double-minded. So in the process of time, our understanding will come in alignment with His Word, and we will one day on this handful of topics that I look at as double-minded from the corporate body, will come to the final answer. So until then, there's going to be some various views, and that's pretty normal with eschatology, the study of the end time events. But I wanted us to be mindful of the Ottoman Empire Islamic connection, There's 12ers who are expecting their Mahdi, which we know will be the anti-Messiah. There's Shiites, and that mainly encompasses countries like Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and there's Sunnis. And really the Sunnis and the Shiites often butt heads. They don't get along. So I gleaned a lot of information about them from a YouTube that Kimberly Rogers Brown did, and I'll share that either in chat or I'll send a follow-up email. And then, as I shared in one of our sessions, we have to be mindful of the Noahide laws and the Babylonian Talmud, which they call their Torah, and just the, defining of some of these terms can be confusing. So the M, I put down Maimonides, who was, a philosopher and had probably much input with the Talmud, as well as Menachem Mendel Schneerson and the Chabad Lubavitch movement. Now, the Chabad Lubavitch movement is strongly behind the Noahide laws. And we know in the Noahide laws, they promote, if someone is found guilty, they do have in those laws, which have subsections in their Noahide laws about beheadings. And we also know under Islam, under Sharia law, they have laws about beheading. So that's something that we have to be mindful of. And then for the E, I put that equaling evil, unholy, global, political, religious, and social alliances. So as we go along, I mainly want us to know that we're going to be focusing on the history of Rome and seeing so much more than we've never seen before. But we also acknowledge that there's a whole lot of other stuff going along in history at the same time. And it will all come to a head in the end of days. Now, just for a quick review, the map of Islam from 612 to 750 AD, I know that's really small, but they were in control of the Middle East where present-day Jerusalem is. And under Muhammad, he got that darker brown area, and then they did expand into some of these green areas. So that's what it looked like around 612, 750 AD. And then the Abbasid Caliphate ran from 750 to 1258 AD, and that's the territory, again, surrounding Jerusalem during that time period. And we have the Ottoman Empire, 1299 to 1758, excuse me, AD. And again, the little red circle shows where present-day Jerusalem is. And the decline of the Ottoman Empire started taking place from 1566 to 1807, and that was just resourced out of Britannica. And then the Ottoman Empire showed a great decline on this map in 1920 AD of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't very large at all. And we know, just pulling up Wikipedia, with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, they, with the Rothschild, began the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, and Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1914. Now, by late 1917, in the lead up to the Balfour Declaration, the wider war had reached a stalemate with two of Britain's allies not fully engaged. The United States had yet to suffer a casualty, and the Russians were in the midst of a revolution with the Bolsheviks taking over the government. A stalemate in southern Palestine was broken by the Battle of Beersheba on the 31st of October 1917. The release of the final declaration was authorized on the 31st of October. The preceding cabinet discussion had referenced perceived propaganda benefits amongst the worldwide Jewish community for the Allied war effort. And that's just from Wikipedia researching the Balfour Declaration. And some of these things, it's best to also do some side research on your own to understand our history, because as we know, history has been rewritten in many cases. So I hope that little acronym I came up with kind of keeps in mind the many tentacles of this end time beast and these unholy alliances that are coming together. And we've seen that take place in our day and age. But we know believers belong to Yahweh, not to various religions. And Yahusha is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. We are Israel, born from above. That is the true Israel. Romans 9, verse 6 through 8. And we are the temple with his Ruach HaKodesh dwelling in us and through us. So here are just some of the examples that I just reviewed with everyone. Like in February 2019, the Pope with the Grand Imam signed historic declaration of peace. And also just a snippet out of that article, it said the document, which was signed at a gathering of religious leaders from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other faiths, pledge peace, freedom, and women's rights. Well, we know there's a huge ecumenical movement going on trying to reach out to charismatic and traditional churches to just kind of blow off all that, the Dark Ages and that sort of thing from the Protestant Reformation movement, and just all come together, and so we see that those unholy alliances taking place. Now, we all came from various denominations, but as we studied and as we learned, we all also had a call to come out of her, my people, and to realize who we are. We are Israel, we are the temple, and our high priest is Yahushua HaMashiach. And it's all about a direct relationship with him and keeping his moedim and understanding all these things. It's not about man-driven religions. It's about a relationship with him. And then above here with President Trump and Jared and Ivanka, this was when they signed that anti-Semitism executive order. So there's, a lot of executive orders coming through the pipe as well. And these terms are defined in various ways, and it should be very concerning because it takes away freedom of speech. And then we see this annual event that takes place in the Oval Office of signing the National Education Day that has within it the Noahide laws. So as I shared before, that's been signed by 7 presidents since Jimmy Carter, and it was snuck into U.S. law, Public Law 102.14, in I believe 1991 or 1992. And I have on my website the testimony of a congressman that was there, and he tells us the truth of how they slipped that in. So these are the tentacles, and this is what made me think of that acronym, to use the acronym ROAM, to also see the many, many tentacles that are coming together. Now, we reviewed this timeline, so I'm not going over it in great detail again, but we know where we are on this timeline, 606 BC, with the Babylonian exile of the house of Judah. And we're seeing the follow-up with Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then the Iron Kingdom of Rome, in which Yahushua HaMashiach was born during that time period of Rome. And then we do know the destruction of Jerusalem in 68 to 70 AD. So keep that in mind, because we see how quickly they followed one another, and we see that Yahushua was born under the Iron Kingdom of Rome. Now, this is a sample of a timeline I put together, and it helps explain the Melchizedek priesthood. And so I have reviewed this timeline on some of my other presentations, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but excuse me. But we know we have the promise given to Abraham in Genesis 12, followed by, after the battle of the kings, he meets with Melchizedek, who was king of Salem and priest of the Most High Elohim. And he blesses Abraham, and they partake in bread and wine. So in Genesis 12, Abraham gets that unconditional promise. He asks Yahweh for a guarantee, and that's given in Genesis 15. And he also tells Abraham it's going to be 4 generations before this starts to take place. So then we know that Moses is called, that he leads them out of Egypt captivity to Mount Sinai, and Yahweh proposes to them with the book of the covenant, which is blood ratified. And we see the preachers of righteousness, the Melchizedek priesthood, beginning with Adam, and it goes all the way through time to this very day. So they remained in their covenant of marriage only about 40 days, so this timeline is not to scale, before they sinned with the golden calf. And 3,000 end up dying because they committed adultery. And because of that, he wanted to wipe them out. Moses intercedes and he spares their lives. But because of all this, the book of the law is implemented, beginning with Exodus 24:12 through Deuteronomy and into the beginning chapters of Joshua. And the Aaronic Levitical priesthood and the tabernacle system would be implementing the book of the law. And the Melchizedek priesthood continued on, but in a denigrated parallel position. And all of this would take place. This book of the law would be a tutor that is highly valuable, because it was always pointing to Yahushua HaMashiach. And we can learn a wealth of information about Yahushua through the book of the law, and we know that Yahushua was born under the book of the law, but at the same time, Yahushua was ushering in the new covenant confirming gospel, and once again elevating the Melchizedek priesthood to the elevated position where he rules and reigns as high priest. And 3,000 were saved in Acts, as we read on Pentecost. So we know that the tribe of Levi was very important to biblical history, and the tribe of Levi will be part of also of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation under the order of Melchizedek, because Yahushua came to save the world, not to condemn the world. And that's recorded in Revelation 5, verse 9 and 10. So let's bring in now what we've been studying about Daniel. And through the graphics from the book, we know that Yah had passed the scepter on to Adam. We know that Adam and Eve fell in the garden, and because of that, power to rule was seized by Satan. And then it is passed on to Nimrod at Babel. What I want us to be mindful of is that there's the various timelines and what's going on here. So yes, Adam and Eve Adam lost the power to rule, but also he worked through Adam, and Adam was the first preacher of righteousness. And we know Noah was the 8th preacher of righteousness. And after Genesis 6, with the fallen angels mating with women, taking women, and then the giants were in the land, that Yahweh destroyed the earth with the flood, and Noah built an ark and saved his family. So the preachers of righteousness were also running parallel in history, as also, you know, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Okay, now in our prologue in the book, we know Ham begot Cush, and Cush begot Nimrod. Okay, so we see how where Nimrod came from. That's recorded in Genesis 11. So Nimrod started wanting to build this one world government, one world language, the building of Babel, and it is interrupted by the confusion of tongues, and builders disperse. Then we start seeing the generations of Shem, the generations of Terah, the family of Abram, who later is named Abraham, with Abram and Lot that are removed from Ur to Haran. So that takes place right after Genesis 11. We have it recorded in Genesis 12, where the promise is given to Abraham. So that begins that timeline I just shared with you all. So we know Abraham is promised by Yahweh to make him into a great nation. And Abraham and Sarah contemplated this on how can this be? We're so old. Sarah was barren. How was she going to have a child? And, you know, sometimes we start thinking in the flesh and forgetting how powerful Yahweh is. So Sarah offers Hagar, her concubine, to Abraham, and she births Ishmael. And down the line, Yahweh does bless Ishmael, and he too becomes a great nation and has 12 princesses. But that was not where the promise was going to come through. The promise was going to come through Abraham and Sarah. So it's very important to know that the promise came through Abraham and Sarah, because Abraham did have a child by Hagar, and later on has children by Keturah. So Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, and he is the one that the covenant of promise comes through. Because just like Yahweh flayed the animals, guaranteeing his promise to make him a great nation, he also, Abraham enters in the covenant of circumcision, flaying his flesh at age 99, and Ishmael was circumcised at age 30. But the seed, the promised seed, would pass through Abraham's flayed flesh of his circumcision and unite in Sarah the seed of promise, which was Isaac. Then we know Isaac and Rebekah had Esau and Yaakov, Jacob. And Esau, Jacob is given the blessing, and because of those circumstances, Esau is very upset, and he ends up, in so many words, crossing over to the pagan line through marrying into the Ishmael line. He becomes very prominent, and he actually usurps the Ishmaelites. And we see the birthing of Islam, we see Sunni, we see Shiites, and Esau's name is pretty much synonymous with the name Edom and also Mount Seir. So just put that in your memory there. Now, Jacob marries Rachel, and also, of course, we know he married Leah first, and also had children by two concubines, one of Leah's concubine and one of Rachel's concubines. And thus Jacob wrestles with Yahweh and is named Israel. And he, at that time, Israel is birthed, and through Jacob comes the 12 patriarchs. So just keep that in mind as well. I just want us to have a little more background history. It's impossible to go in great detail, but an overall comprehension of these things, the more you see it, the more you review it, the more you'll own it and understand it. So now, bringing it back home to where we are in our study, after the northern house of Israel is exiled to Assyria, and the southern house of Judah is exiled after Nebuchadnezzar takes over Jerusalem. And so we have that line that we're looking at: Nebuchadnezzar, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. So here again, just thinking about the previous timeline I showed you, Yahushua HaMashiach was born under the book of the law, and he was born under the time of the Roman rule. And that Roman rule, as we know, extends from 168 BC, and we know Yahushua was born around 2 BC, some even say 6 BC, and died anywhere, I've heard, from 27 AD to 33 AD, based on the various calendars, and Charlene's the one to just, address a lot of those differences. But we see that Yahushua was born during and under the Roman rule. So that's connecting us to our timeline chart in the book of Daniel. Now, just for some people that are new to understanding the Melchizedek priesthood in which we are, because Yahushua is our high priest after the Melchizedek order, Psalm 110:4. Now, we know that promise that was given to Abraham and the proposal given was accepted by the people coming out of Egypt, coming out of being in captivity in Egypt. And we have to understand, to this very day, we are in exile as well. And there will be a greater exodus, just as the exodus we've read about in Exodus, the book of Exodus. And that marriage covenant was blood ratified, meaning you cannot add to it and you cannot take away from it, but you can break a blood ratified covenant, and that's what the people did. And we know the 4 elements of a blood ratified covenant: proposal, acceptance, blood ratification, covenant, confirming meal. And so, like I already reviewed, they committed adultery with the golden calf. They, in essence, went into marriage counseling mode, and the book of the law served as a tutor. They didn't learn very well at all. Even after they were given they were brought into the promised land, they were given all their territories and all these things, and they still sinned. House of Israel sinned, the house of Judah sinned, and all these green sparks here and the yellow sparks, this is a world map showing that eventually all 12 tribes were dispersed, but we know that Yahweh divorced Israel, and Judah, her sister, was worse than she was, and in essence, the destruction of Jerusalem took place in 70 AD approximately, and everything was destroyed. So then, of course, Yahushua came to bring us the new blood-ratified covenant, which through the new covenant confirming gospel, he chose to lay down his life and take it back up again instead of wiping all of them out after the sin of the golden calf, because that guaranteed promise back in Genesis 15 required that if that covenant was going to be broken, now because of the guarantee, someone would have to die. That someone we know now was Yahushua HaMashiach. And then with the new covenant confirming gospel, he is proposed to the world, for Yah so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So that proposal extends to anyone that receives him and accepts his proposal. And it was blood ratified with his precious blood. And then we partake of the covenant confirming meal of bread and wine. And that's why at Passover we do that. And then we take off our sandals, our authority. Sandals represent authority in one's lives. So we are standing on holy ground when we partake of that covenant confirming meal, and we take off our sandals and we wash each other's feet, because that's showing that we did that priestly transference into the Melchizedek priesthood, just like it was epic that Moses was available. Him and Joshua were up on the mount, so they stayed in that Melchizedek priesthood, but everyone below had sinned and broken the covenant. And so Moses was instrumental in washing and preparing Aaron and his sons to institute the Aaronic Levitical priesthood. So it's a similar thing when we wash each other's feet. It's a priestly duty, recognizing who we are. And that's so very important to never, never lose sight of that. So we have two nations, good and evil, warring together. And in our Revelation studies I did, we brought that out often. And we recalled the warring in the womb. So we've already gone over the promise to Abraham. We mentioned about Abraham and Hagar that had Ishmael. And in Genesis 17:20 it reads, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. See, I shall bless him and shall make him fruitful and greatly increase him. He is to bring forth 12 princes, and I shall make him a great nation." That was Yahweh speaking to Hagar. Now, Abraham and Sarah had Isaac in Genesis 17:19, very important. And Elohim said, because Abraham was thinking he would be blessed through Ishmael, and Yahweh told him, no, Sarah, your wife, is truly bearing a son to you, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I shall establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. So all of this is taking place on this chart to your left between Nimrod at Babel and before Babylon, okay? So we have the union of Isaac and Rebekah, and Becca begot Esau and Jacob, and Esau sold his birthright. Genesis 25:23. And Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older serve the younger. So we also read Jacob, who is also, his name was changed to Israel, had the 12 patriarch tribes. In Genesis 46:2 it reads, and in verse 3, "And Elohim spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And he said, I am the Elohim of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I shall make you there into a great nation. So that was the time that Joseph had already been sent before them to when his brothers sold him, and he ends up in Egypt, and a great drought comes on the land, and it really forces Jacob and the rest of the sons to go to Egypt, and they settle in Goshen, and they were shepherds, so they were considered unclean. And so we are an extension of Israel to this very day. And what we are experiencing today, we may not fully understand why things are happening, but just like in that day, Yahweh allowed a great famine in the land to coalesce Jacob and all the patriarchs into one place, into Goshen. So he pulled them out of the wilderness and coalesced them in one place. They were considered unclean because they were shepherds, and Egyptians thought shepherds were unclean. So we face a similar scenario. We are all scattered in the wilderness, and these things that unfold in the end of time may come about to where we too may be considered unclean by refusing the vaccine or so forth, so on. We too, Yahweh may use that. I'm not saying he will, but he could use that to coalesce his bride, his people, into one location. So history repeats itself, and we read about the greater Exodus in Isaiah 11:11 through, I think, like 21, if something like that. So the war has always been between two kingdoms, as we read in the prologue. Yahusha's kingdom and Satan's. This world is what he rules. And it's a war between good and evil. So sometimes we make it more complicated than it has to be, because as Charlene has shown us, as history unfolds, we definitely can identify the players. Sometimes we speculate in the future, but as that history unfolds, we go, aha, that's the answer. And so good and evil can also be represented by Jacob, Israel, and Esau. Only by faith, any of us. Just like Esau crossed over to the pagan side, those that are lost can cross over to the kingdom side of Yahushua HaMashiach. The door is open, but each individual must receive him and accept his proposal, and so forth. So only by faith in Yahushua and being washed by the blood of the Lamb does one enter the kingdom after the order of Melchizedek. Yahushua's proposal has been extended to every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. This world wants us to be divided with race, with ethnicity, with politics, with all kinds of stuff. Yahweh wants to bring his people together because he loves people. He came to seek and save the lost. So when we look at these patterns and sequencing, which are laid out so beautifully in our study book, we see the gold head right here, Babylon. We see the silver chest and arms, Medo-Persia. We see the brass belly and thighs, Greece. We see kingdom number 4 is Rome, pagan imperial Rome, 168 to 476 AD. Here in the 5th kingdom, we know it's going to be feet part of iron. In the 6th kingdom, it's going to be feet part of clay. In the 7th kingdom, it's going to be toes of iron and clay. But look how beautiful this section is here. We don't want to miss this. because there's so much stuff going on right here. So we know Rome, 168 BC to 476 AD. There's a lot of stuff going on during that time. We have the Maccabean Revolt, 167 to 160 BC. We have the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 136 BC. And praise Yah, we have Yahushua HaMashiach ushering in his kingdom, and he is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, you know, I don't know what we will discover as we go along. I am so looking forward to this study. I cannot tell you how much. But we do know that in that first century, with the outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh, the believers did not mix with the Roman-controlled corrupted temple system and the corrupted Aaronic Levitical priesthood at that time. We know John the Immerser was the true high priest that had to function out in the wilderness because of this corruption. And we know the persecution of the first century believers. They did not mix. And we see that when the fifth kingdom comes, it's going to be weakened, but that iron is still there. That iron representing Rome is still there, but believers don't mix with it. Personally, I see the clay representing believers. I may learn more about the clay. I'm not saying I have all of this correct. I'm just sharing with you where I'm at and where I'm coming from here, and for us to ponder this. So Yahushua HaMashiach ushered in his kingdom of priests after the order of Melchizedek from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And I see them as represented as the clay. Why? Because in a recent Shabbat study, we studied the red heifer. And I came across a study that Kimberly Rogers Brown did on the red heifer. Now, the red heifer most certainly represents Yahushua HaMashiach and the Ruach HaKodesh, but she brought in another angle that was really phenomenal, because this is something I did ponder too, because a heifer is female, and I know there's not male or female in the kingdom of Yahweh, but the bride is often spoken of in female terms. And so the red heifer, the para adumah, is from the earth, or, you know, from clay of the earth, that goes to the altar outside the gate to join with Yahusha and his Ruach HaKodesh. It is the altar that sanctifies the gift. We, the bride, have to go outside the gate to the altar, as you can see represented by the red heifer, because we, the bride, the believers, have been crucified with Messiah. And we go to the altar that sanctifies us through the shed precious blood of Yahusha. So that was a very interesting angle, and really brings out the connection with clay, the earth. So I just wanted to share that. So, but who makes up Rome and the coming beast? We're going to see a lot of mixing and coalescing. It's really very interesting, the many tentacles and how all this comes together in this conglomerate. So I brought in, of course, we must kind of keep in our mind about Esau, about Islam. We know about Muhammad began spreading his message about 612 to 750 AD. We do, there are people that say that a lot of that was instituted, that theology was pushed through Catholicism, the papal supremacy system. I don't know, I cannot verify that. but we do see these various caliphates. Bring it to the 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then I showed y'all how 1920 it was very small. So we see Islam also suffered a big head wound as well. We've already seen how Catholicism, the papal supremacy #1, suffered a head wound. So we see different people with different points of view will mention things like this. So we have to be mindful of it as we study, because we really want to understand these things that like Charlene has studied in depth. And I'm just looking forward to gleaning from her work on that and the insights from our brothers, because we are one body. None of us have all the answers, because I so believe it's because he wants to pull us together. He's given each one of us a piece of the puzzle. We have to grab from this sister, from this brother. We take it back to his word and we see if these things be so, because he wants us to be engaged. He wants us to know. He wants us to understand these timelines. So like we've seen so far, Rome's head wound was in 1798, but look at all the action taking place around. So I just put in these time charts for Muhammad's life, and this chart talking about the Maccabean revolt, just to remind people, go and look at some of this history, the Bar Kokhba revolt as well. So the Fifth Kingdom will see the papal supremacy #1 rise 476 AD to 538, and then rules from 538 to 1798, and we'll see the 1,260 literal years, and we'll get there and we'll understand how these numbers are determined. We're going to see #6, Papal II, rise 1798 to 1801, waxing great from 1801 to present. So we're going to get all this history as well. So the end time battle of Revelation is ultimately the continuing birthright and blessing war between Esau, Rome / Edom connection. There seems to be a strong Rome-Edom connection. And Yaakov, Israel, and we are Israel. So again, those that believe in Yahushua HaMashiach and those that do not. Genesis 27:38 through 40. And Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me too, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, "See, your dwelling is of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of the heavens from above. And by your sword you are to live and serve your brother. And it shall be when you grow restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck." Okay, that's a prophetic verse right there. We'll keep that in our mind. Esau, also we know Esau ran Jacob out of the land of his inheritance. We read about that in Genesis 27:42 through 43. And the words of Esau, her older son, were reported to Rebekah, and she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, "See, your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you to kill you. And now, my son, listen to my voice and rise, flee to my brother Laban in Haran." Anyway, let me just keep on going. All right, so Esau and the Roman Empire. In one of the studies, Kimberly Rogers Brown brings out some key components to consider with the line of Ishmael and Esau. She shares, and I verified this, that many Western and Jewish historians claim Rome is Edom and the wellspring of Roman Catholic Church. Edomites are believed to have been widely dispersed after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD. The Romans became associated with a wild boar associated with Edomites. Edom was involved in the destruction of the first temple by taking advantage of the situation and seizing control of parts of Judah. That's recorded in all of those scriptures listed there in Ezekiel and the verses in Obadiah. Edom also took part in the destruction of Jerusalem. We read in Psalm 137, 7 and 8, "Remember, O Yahweh, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, lay it bare to its foundation. O daughter of Babel, who are to be destroyed, blessed is he who repays you your deed, what you did to us." So through history, there's been a connection there. And then briefly, just an excerpt from this Britannica about the Turkish Khazars that converted to Judaism, and many of them settled in the European areas. So although basically the Khazar state bore little resemblance to the other Turkic empires of Central Eurasia, it was headed by a secluded supreme ruler of semi-religious character called a Kagan, who wielded little real power, and by tribal chieftains, each known as a beg. The state's military organization also seems to have lacked the forcefulness of those of the greater Turkic Mongol empires. The Khazars seem to have been more inclined to a sedentary way of life, building towns and fortresses, tilling the soil and planting gardens and vineyards. Trade and the collection of tribute were major sources of income, but the most striking characteristics of the Khazars, which that was a Muslim territory and most were probably Muslim, was the apparent adoption of Judaism. So they converted to Judaism by the Kagan and the greater part of the ruling class in about 740. The circumstances of the conversion remain obscure, the depth of their adoption of Judaism difficult to assess, but the fact itself is undisputed and unparalleled in Central Eurasian history. A few scholars have even asserted that the Judaized Khazars were the remote ancestors of many Eastern European and Russian Jews. Whatever the case may be, religious tolerance was practiced in the Khazar Empire, and paganism continued to flourish among the population. So the sequence, the pattern, were all on track, and we do recognize the things that are going on in the parallel history and the mixing and the blending. And honestly, at this point, only Yahweh knows who is who. Only Yahweh will be able to separate the wheat from the tares. Only Yahweh. Because the records have been obscured, many have been lost. Even when they came back from Babylon, people couldn't justify their genealogy and so forth and so on. And when Yahusha ushered in the Melchizedek kingdom of priests, the Aaronic Levitical priesthood had completed their very valuable service. But now Yahusha has ushered in the Melchizedek priesthood, and the Aaronic Levitical priesthood served its role until that point. But man wanted it to persevere. And so whatever exists today is man-driven, not Yah-driven. So all these realms that were displayed in the sequencing still reflect the recapping structure chart of the feet part of iron, feet part of clay, and the toes with iron and clay. In the next several sessions, we're going to be looking at new keys that have been given to unlock the prophetic time frame of Daniel 12. And Charlene had told us there was more, and so we're fixing to see what that more entails. we've already prayed, so thank you, Carol Ann. So declaring the end from the beginning. Kim, would you like to read these two verses, please?
Yes. Declaring the end from the beginning, Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. Remember the former things of old, for I am Yahweh, and there is none else. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure.
Okay, so perhaps you are wondering how Daniel chapter 4 declares anything about Daniel 12's ends, how it ends. So now we're going to see how all of this works. In King Nebuchadnezzar's second vision, we know out of the 5 visions in Daniel's book, 2 of them were given to King Nebuchadnezzar. And I think we all know the king's first vision is found in chapter 2. Of course, that was the statue, right? And today we're going to look at the king's second vision, and that's about the tree. Now, Daniel 2, the king simply could not remember his vision, and obviously the king needed some help. The vision needed an interpreter for the image of metals and clay. And number 3, Chaldeans failed the test. The king had trusted that his magicians could tell him what the dream was and interpret it, but the Chaldeans failed it. And they said to the king, tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. So the king became very angry with that answer, and as a result, a death decree was enacted immediately. So Yahweh had already planned that Daniel was the appointed man for this emergency. He was divinely commissioned to give the heavenly interpretation and calm everything down, which, as you may recall, saved all in the king's court from the death decree. This vision had to do with events surrounding Yahweh's people. There are no timelines included there. This is a very simple vision, as well as the prophecy for all succeeding visions. As you further your studies in prophecy, you'll see just how important this vision is. Daniel 4, the king's second vision, and the author is King Nebuchadnezzar. And this chapter is written by the king himself. This time, the king remembered every detail of his dream. It was definitely about a huge, huge tree. Instead of a death decree for the king's court, there was a divine decree issued ahead. This vision had to do with events surrounding only the king. And it's a very simple vision, but with one extra detail, that being, it has a timeline of 7 years. In fact, it's the first vision in Daniel's book that records a timeline. The Chaldeans failed again when they were asked to interpret the dream, even though this time the king told them every detail of the dream. Their excuses did not impress the king, but the king remembered that Daniel helped him out the first time, and so again, Daniel was Yahweh's appointed man. Twice, Daniel was used to teach the king of the true creator, Yahweh. So let's take a closer look at these 2 dreams. The image in Daniel 2 was given as an idol word picture to the king. The king was into, if you will, idol worship. That may have been the reason he was so impressed with the dream and that he felt it was so important, even though he could not recall the dream. A divine interpretation was given to Daniel for this symbolic dream. But why was the king able to remember the second dream? Well, this vision was given in an ordinary word picture. He could recall every detail of the dream since everything related to something he already knew about. As before, Daniel took the Chaldeans' place of giving the interpretation. But the question still remains, is the dream written with symbols, or is it written in literal language without symbols? Does the vision of the tree follow the structural components given in Daniel 2? Well, we are all gathered together tonight to see that the answer is yes. So let's just do a little review. Let's just begin with a short review of the Daniel 2 thumbnail taken from his structure chart. By now, you should all know how this works, but just in case there is someone new here that may have missed a session or two, this is what happens. Every vision begins with the heavenly scene. That's a very good place to start, isn't it? Then, following that, there's an interlude question that arises about what was seen in the vision. Remember, we called this interlude quote unquote interruption because it quote unquote comes between the actual vision and the explanation of the vision. Following the interlude is the historic prophetic outline. This is the portion of the vision chapter where Daniel gives the interpretation for the heavenly scene, which is always an interesting part. Fourthly, then the answer to the interlude question follows immediately. This happens in every single vision. And of course, at the very end, Daniel concludes with the end time event as to be expected. Remember all the different ways we found the forward progressive movement? We looked at verses that moved forward. We looked at kingdoms that moved forward. We looked at dates that moved forward. And the pattern was simple. Now let's compare this to Daniel 4 and see if it's the same. So Daniel 4 also follows the structural pattern. We have the forward progressive movement. We have the king relayed the vision from the heavenly scene. This is followed by an interlude question. Then Daniel explains the vision in the outline portion. We see the answer given, and then we see the prophetic vision is fulfilled. So again, we see the pattern is very simple, and it's the same pattern in Daniel 7, in Daniel 8, and the last vision found in Daniel 10 and 12. And these patterns, this sequencing, are going to help us also in Revelation, though there may be some differences that Charlene shared with us last time. The traditional emphasis, humbling the king. In chapters 1, 3, 5, and 6, we have 4 story chapters, and each of them have a traditional emphasis with patterns that will repeat at the end of time. Well, this chapter also has a traditional emphasis as well. Most say the traditional emphasis relates to the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar had to be humbled. He was just too proud for his own good. But let's look first at the traditional conflict and resolution in this chapter. Yes, indeed, the conflict in this vision chapter is between the pagan king's pride, which was definitely arrayed against Yahweh. He had forgotten just who had given him this large dominion to begin with. Verse 30 records the king's words, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" In the end, Yahweh wins as the king is turned out to eat grass in the pasture until at last he gives Yahweh honor. Even King Nebuchadnezzar admitted in verse 37, the King of heaven is able to abase. Although this traditional emphasis has some really good practical lessons for us today, there is a special part of this chapter that connects to Revelation. Do you know what it could be? The concepts in Daniel 4 provide connecting principles for all timelines in Daniel and Revelation. Timelines. The answer is timelines. Timelines are always exciting. But if we don't know how to manage timelines, which learning about timelines for me, this is the first time that I've ever had the opportunity to study and learn about timelines. So if we don't know how to manage timelines, prophecy can be frustrating and we can make a big mess of it. And so, we sometimes have to go back and correct things we said, whereas we've also seen how some people haven't learned things wrong the first time and they're learning everything right the first time makes it much easier. So all timelines are meant to tell the reader where are we in the prophetic stream of time. There are many types of timelines, but how can we tell the difference? Do timelines have rules? Do we have to know the rules? Why? And the ultimate question, will this information affect my salvation? Definitely not. How we understand prophetic timelines has nothing to do with anyone's salvation, but they have everything to do with understanding the timing of prophetic events in the past and future, including those in Revelation. That's why we want to look and see how Daniel and Revelation are connected with prophetic timelines, and most people want to understand them at the same time. And if any generation wants to understand these timelines, it is our generation. Understanding Daniel and Revelation timelines through concepts in Daniel 4, maybe this is just a really good place to do this brief comparison of the timelines that can be found in Daniel and Revelation. Of course, you already know that Daniel 4 has the first timeline of 7 years, and we're going to be looking at that in great detail today. Daniel 7 has a timeline that we'll call the 1260. We'll study that a little bit more later in the next PowerPoint. The Daniel 8 introduces a longer timeline noted as the 2300 days. Daniel 9 has many timelines. All of them are very, very interesting. Then there's Daniel 12. which has another 3 exciting timelines of 1260, 1290, and 1335 days. And there they are all packed together in 6 short verses. Now, what about Revelation? Well, let's see. Revelation 2, one timeline of 10 days. Revelation 8 has one timeline of about the space of a half hour. Revelation 9, you will find it has 2 5-month timelines that are very interesting. Revelation 11 has 3 timelines, a 42-month, a 1260, and a short one of only 3.5 days. Revelation 12 has 2 timelines. Both of them are 1260s. Revelation 13 has 1 timeline of 42 months. Then in Revelation 17, we find 2 one-hour timelines, and everyone wants to know what these mean. The chapter of Revelation 18 has 4 timelines. One timeline is described as 1 day, and there are 3 one-hour timelines as well. And Revelation 20 has the longest timeline in Revelation. It's called 1,000 years and is mentioned 6 times in that one chapter alone. Deep breath. Okay. In total, Revelation alone mentions 17 timelines. And we submit to you today, based on this great research and work Charlene has put together, most of them are waiting for a future fulfillment still, even though some have tried to fit many of these timelines into the fulfilled prophecies of the historical past. Now, with that many timelines given in prophecy, surely they must play an important part in the near future. Wouldn't you think? I think we all agree, or we wouldn't be coming together on Tuesday nights to check this out and to make these connections and understandings. Timelines are a special light. Oh yes, timelines are a special light in prophecy. They light our path through each important event right up to the end of time. The question is, do you know how to work with all these timelines? No, I don't. I'll admit it. You know, if not, then you'll find that Daniel is the, capital T-H-E, authority on timelines, and his work in this chapter is extremely important. If anyone can help us, Daniel can. Praise y'all. Remember, timelines have a special light. Epilogue timelines of Daniel 12. 3 timelines are mentioned in Daniel's epilogue, the ending of his prophetic book. The explanation of these timelines has been and still is very controversial. In man's eyes, this is a dilemma because a lot of people don't know what to do with these timelines. However, Daniel, the original prophet, supplies his reader with clear instruction for understanding all timelines, including those in his epilogue and Revelation. This is exciting. I don't know about y'all, but this is exciting. Now, we know the vision in Daniel 2 reveals a symbolic image. But in Daniel 4, the tricky question must be asked. Is the vision of Daniel 4 a symbolic vision or a literal vision? That's what we're going to study tonight. Seven main points for understanding prophetic timelines. In order to understand how to work with timelines, first we have to find out whether Daniel 4 is a symbolic vision or a literal vision. So tonight we are going to examine 7 important points. every single point has something to do with questions around timelines found in Daniel and Revelation. First, we are going to define and describe the use of metaphors and similes. Secondly, we will learn the difference between symbolic language and literal language and how to really know the language of a vision. Third, the third point may be a little more difficult as we look at the terms interpretation and application. It's important too. Fourthly, the fourth point is really important as we discover that quote unquote prophetic terminology is not the same as prophetic time. Fifth, the fifth point, we're going to look at the repetition of prophecy and what the consequences are. This section will be very interesting. The sixth point is going to expose the theologian's argument and what I call the sneaky switch. I'm sure you'll be surprised to find out what's been happening. Seventh, and in the last point, we'll look at how timelines begin and end. Do all of them follow a pattern? Should they follow a pattern? What do you think? That's number 7, how prophetic timelines begin and end. In the end, Charlene assures us Daniel 4 will clear the confusion on calculation of timelines when we give very careful consideration to each of these 7 areas. Now let's see how Nebuchadnezzar describes the tree in his dream. A description of the tree. Here's a description of the tree from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. 1, it was a great, strong tree that to him reached clear into the heavens. 2, everyone could see this tree from long distances. 3, it was a beautiful tree with fair leaves, much fruit, and plenty of food for everyone. 4, there was shade and shelter for the beast of the field and nest for the birds. Let's continue. 5, as the king continues to describe the action, he told of a holy watcher that came and hewed down the tree. 6, then the branches were cut off, the leaves shaken to the ground, scattering all the fruit. 7, as a result, the beast and the birds fled, being very frightened. 8, after that, all that was left was a stump, which was bound with iron and brass. 9, for a total of 7 years. A total of 7 years. Does any of this sound like symbolic language to you? Comparison of 2 different trees. Now let's do a comparison of 2 different trees. This is a picture of the tree described in Daniel 4. Now, here's a picture of a tree that would be considered a symbolic tree. Would you not agree? In this seminar, Daniel will demonstrate whether the tree of the king's dream is a symbolic tree or not. Before we begin with the first of our 7 points, I just want to tell you something about prophecy in general. Prophecy is an exact science, just like math, chemistry, and physics. All exact sciences follow rules. Remember your algebra classes? Prophecy must follow rules as well. The fancy name for these rules is the word hermeneutics. I'll be using the term prophetic key, a key that will unlock understanding. I've listed 30 prophetic keys or prophetic rules in the Daniel book, and they are numbered. And of course, all of you have probably discovered those keys. They're on page, I believe, 16 through 21. And if you haven't taken a look at those prophetic keys, that's where they're located. So these prophetic keys are basic rules. Are there any new prophetic keys? Yes, there are. And Charlene will be giving us some insights and reviewing those today with us as we continue this presentation. We've already covered it in the last presentations as well. Now we're ready to look at point 1. Understanding timelines. The first part we are going to look at is the difference between similes and metaphors. We need to explain these terms with a very brief English lesson. Prophetic keys 21A and 21B are really important. Literal language may use figures of speech such as A, similes, and B, metaphors. Did you know that? Some of you may have, because you've probably already reviewed some of these in the book, and we've kind of lightly touched on them, but we're going to learn much more. So let's get started in understanding these terms. Prophetic key 21A, similes. We'll look at these first. Here's the definition. Similes are figures of speech in which two essentially unlike things are compared. Similes are tools of language which often employs the words like or as, using a story as an illustration. Here's a few examples from Revelation 9, verse 7 through 10. Locusts were like horses. Locusts' hair as the hair of women. Locusts' tails like unto scorpions. Do you see any terms or language here that describes something we have not seen on this earth? No, there isn't. We have locusts. We have horses. We know what women's hair looks like. We know about tails and scorpions, don't we? Believe it or not, this is literal language, not symbolic language. Prophetic key number 21B, metaphors. What is a metaphor? The definition is a metaphor is a word or phrase denoting an idea which represents something else. For example, sometimes for a grumpy spouse, someone might say, "He sure was a bear this morning at the breakfast table." Does that mean the spouse was really a bear or just really grumpy? Yes, we understand he was just really grumpy. Why? Because it's a metaphor. So again, the definition of a metaphor is a word or phrase denoting an idea which represents something else. Prophetic key number 21B. Now let's look at some examples from Revelation 9:1. I saw a star fall from heaven. This denotes a created being, not a real star. Other examples, I smell a rat. There's a monkey in the woodpile, or something smells fishy. I'm sure you've heard some of these expressions. There usually isn't a real rat, hopefully not, nor monkey or fish in the thought. It may not sound like it, but this is literal language. Daniel 4 examples of similes and metaphors. Now let's look at these examples in Daniel 4 by reading these selected verses. Verse 20. Kim, would you read verse 20?
The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. It is thou, O king.
So Daniel's using a metaphor when he says, the tree that thou sawest, it is thou, O king. This is a direct application, by the way. Or Daniel could have used similes as well by saying, you, O king, are like that great tree, or you, O king, are as that great tree. What Daniel is doing here is using literal language when he compares the king to the great tree. Conclusion on similes and metaphors. Are you ready to conclude this English lesson on similes and metaphors? So let's do a summary then. Similes are comparisons by using words such as like or as. Metaphors are comparisons by using phrases. Remember, literal language often uses similes or metaphors. Revelation 9 is a perfect example of this, and you can look in Revelation 16 as well. And do remember this prophetic key number 19, that Daniel 4 is written in completely literal language. Therefore, it is to be interpreted literally. So what is the conclusion for point number 1? The language of this vision is 100% literal. Note, there is literal language in symbolic visions as well to carry the thoughts of the symbols. But when there is only literal language, then we know everything about the vision must be interpreted literally. Understanding timelines, symbolic language or literal language. Okay, we're ready to look at point number 2 and how to understand timelines, whether they are couched in symbolic language or literal language. There's a vast difference between these two terms. First, let's look at a prophetic rule that is so important, the Bible that is so important. The Bible is to be understood in its most obvious or literal sense, unless a figure or symbol is employed. Remember, a symbol is a word picture of something that we don't normally see here on this earth. The Bible has to give us a start on interpreting the symbols. Once that has been done, often history can interpret the next set of symbols. If the king saw a symbolic tree, maybe it would have looked like this. Maybe the trunk would have been purple with scales and eyes instead of bark. Maybe the branches would have had an unusual formation. Could the tree have had wings instead of leaves? Would you agree that a tree described in this way would have been considered symbolic? In that case, Daniel would have needed a divine interpreter bringing him the interpretation through a personal vision or dream. Or Gabriel would have been commissioned to give Daniel understanding of a symbolic tree such as this. That leads us to the next question. So this symbolic tree would have required assistance from a divine being given interpretation or Gabriel. Question, does Daniel have an interpreter for this vision? If you have had a chance to read all the verses in Daniel 4, I wonder if you can answer this question. Does Daniel have an interpreter for this vision? This is where your answer comes in. Whatever you have written down. Betty, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
I hope I'm right, but in reading the verses, I would say that Scripture interpreted it for him.
That's correct. So to the question, does Daniel have an interpreter for this vision, like a divine being? The answer is no. There is no interpreter given to Daniel for this vision. Let's remember two rules. Rule number one, for a symbolic vision, Daniel needs an interpreter. Rule number two, for a literal vision, Daniel does not need an interpreter. In the next few slides, maybe we can figure out why, as Betty alluded to. There were three contemporary prophets we've seen on our timeline and we have discussed. Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah were commissioned to reveal heaven's purpose to men and to elicit cooperation with it. This divine plan was in the best interest of Yahweh's people, even if they didn't think so. Daniel was exiled to Babylon in 606 BC. We've clearly defined that. He was heaven's ordained ambassador to the court of the king to make known Yahweh's divine will and secure cooperation on behalf of God's people. It was quite a huge task, and he was a young man starting out. Ezekiel was exiled to Babylon in 597 BC, almost 10 years after Daniel. He had the same message as Jeremiah, but for those already in Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah, on the other hand, was known as the weeping prophet, remained with the Jews who were left in Judea. Remember, he eventually ended up in Egypt against his will and Yahweh's will. All three of these prophets had the same message. Accept your condition of exile. You must submit to the king of Babylon for 70 years. That is what they proclaimed. And remember, God's people had to contend with false prophets that said they would never be carried off to Babylon. We may have to contend with similar events in the near future, and there are plenty of false prophets out there. It's disheartening how many people are believing so many lies. Now, Daniel and Ezekiel were contemporaries in Babylon. If we put some facts in order, this will assist us in understanding this vision. We just mentioned that Daniel was exiled in 606 BC. Ezekiel followed in 597 BC. Ezekiel 17, chapter 17, was written in approximately 594 BC. Therefore, this chapter compares King Jehoiachin to the top of a cedar tree. Ezekiel 31 and 32 was written about 588 BC. Here, Pharaoh of Egypt is compared to a cedar tree in Lebanon. In 569 BC, this is the approximate date of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the tree. So can you see that Daniel had access to Ezekiel's prophecies about 20 years in advance of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream? But what does that mean? Let's take a closer look at Ezekiel's prophecies. Many years previous to the Babylonian captivity, Ezekiel was instructed to give prophecies concerning Assyria and Egypt. These two nations were compared to trees. Let's look at some prophetic facts. First prophetic fact, Assyria had at one time surpassed Egypt in power and prominence, but it had not been able to escape divine destruction. Remember, Sennacherib, the Assyrian leader, not only reproached and blasphemed Yahweh, but he also threatened Israel with destruction. At that point, it was only a short time when the angel of Yahweh struck dead 185,000 men of his army in one night. He ended up returning with a shamed face to his own land, and that's recorded in 2 Kings 19, Chronicles 32:21, and so forth. Ezekiel's chapters warn the Pharaoh of Egypt that his fate would be the same as the Assyrian nation if he did not change his ways. Yes, many decades before, Ezekiel had already predicted the fate of Egypt's Pharaoh, comparing him to a tree. Let's read what he wrote. Yet you too, Pharaoh, will be brought down with the trees to the earth below. You will lie among those killed by the sword. This is what the sovereign Yahweh says to Pharaoh. The sword of the king of Babylon will come against you. What was Ezekiel's prophetic warning? Pharaoh was reminded of Assyrian's fate. If Egypt does not turn from its wicked ways, judgment will come against her, just as it had against Assyria. And what was the historic fulfillment? Once Egypt came under Babylonian rule, she never achieved her former glorious status in the world. The description of Ezekiel's prophetic tree is very similar to the vision given to King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, isn't it? Daniel witnessed this fulfillment of prophecy. So remember, Daniel witnessed this fulfillment of prophecy. Is it any wonder he knew exactly what King Nebuchadnezzar's dream meant? So Daniel saw this fulfilled in his lifetime. Remember, at the time King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of the tree being cut down, Daniel already had access to Ezekiel's prophecies for over 20 years. The fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecies also provided the interpretation for the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel immediately knew what the dream meant. However, Daniel was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. We find that in Daniel 4, verse 19. The Strong's definition of astonished is to be stunned, amazed, overwhelmed. Daniel knew very well what the dream meant. He just didn't want to be the one to give the bad news to the king. Would you? I don't think so. Daniel's delay for 1 hour. Why? When the king relayed the dream, why was Daniel so stunned for 1 literal hour? we read, he was so fixed in thought and profound silence about the meaning of this dream until the king addressed him, because Daniel was well acquainted with Ezekiel's prophecies comparing kings and pharaohs to trees. He immediately knew the fearful consequences of this dream concerning King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel also knew the danger of revealing bad news to the king, another death decree. In those days, you just didn't do that. The king assured Daniel he was safe, no matter what, because by this time, he had a special regard for this captive Jew. Out of courtesy and respect to the king, Daniel replied, "My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation to thine enemies." Now, let's take a closer look at some of the verses in chapter 4 and see how Daniel understood the application for the king. How verse 11 applied to the king. So we'll start with verse 11 to see how all of this applies to King Nebuchadnezzar. We'll look at a phrase at a time. The tree grew, meaning Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was glorious, known to all, becoming more glorious over the years. Do any of you recall the hanging gardens that he built, considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the world? Now the next phrase tells us, and the tree was strong. As the tree was well proportioned in height, mass, and foliage, so Babylon was proportioned in wealth, military strength, and social status. Military strength could refer to the trunk, firmly fixed in the earth, providing safety from any enemy. Continuing on, the verse reads in 11c, "And the height thereof reached unto the heaven," meaning this kingdom extended in every direction. And finally, the verse 11d, "And the sight thereof to the end of all the earth," meaning the kingdom was so conspicuous that it was known everywhere. Nebuchadnezzar was a sovereign that had universal sway. So Nebuchadnezzar was a king that had universal sway. All men would be subject to him, just as the previous prophecies of Ezekiel and Jeremiah had foretold. Verse 12a, "The leaves were thereof were fair." The leaves thereof were fair, meaning Babylon was in the prime of its growth and life. There were no signs of decay in this kingdom, only vigorous and healthy growth, resembling a monarch in his glory. "And the fruit thereof much." Babylon was full of goodness, life, and vitality. There were many benefits for all citizens, and it was meat for all, food for all. This indicates the dependence of the multitudes upon the king to provide food and liberal favors. It is written that Babylon had enough food supply within its walls for 7 years, and of course, with the Euphrates River running through the midst of it, there was food and water for all for a long time. The beast of the field had shadow under it. The fowls in the heaven dwelt in the boughs. The shade represented the blessings of protection and peace, care for the widows, fatherless, and poor. Being known as the Golden City, Babylon had a tremendous amount of wealth. There was no difficulty to provide for everyone. All flesh was fed of it, meaning the king is likened to the tree. Therefore, he was to furnish protection, shelter, and food for all citizens. How verse 13 applied to the king. Verse 13 tells us what happens next. "And behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven." The character of the watcher was that of a holy one from heaven, as recorded in Psalm 103:20. "The holy watcher obeyed the word of Yahweh. Bless Yahweh, you his angels, that excel in strength, that do his commandments, hearkening unto the voice of his word. How verse 14 applied to the king. Hew down the tree. Divine orders are given to the watcher to take the king off his throne. Why? Because the king's pride came before the care of his subjects. Cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. The king and kingdom were to be utterly stripped of all glory and beauty. Calamity, humiliation, and desolation were imminent. The glory of the kingdom is at stake. The subjects are at loss without their leader. So let's move on to verse 15 now. Leave the stump of his roots in the earth. Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom are not completely dead. In time, a new shoot will spring forth, giving life again to the kingdom. Though the king falls, vitality remains in the root of the kingdom of Babylon. The king would be restored to his reason and power. Remember, as the image in Daniel 2 had clay in the feet and toes, the roots of this tree also find footing in the clay of the earth. Eventually, all root kingdoms will subdivide and mix with the clay of the earth at the end of time. Even with a band of iron and brass, the banding is given to any valuable stump to preserve it from being dried out or plowed under. What else? Well, the binding also gave hope that the stump would retain moisture to spring up again. When the last of the Babylonian kings were finally cut off, the kingdoms that followed were of brass, grease, and iron, representing Rome. So can you see how the roots of Babylon extended to the very end of time? And just another point here, iron and brass also connects to the bronze claws and iron teeth of the fourth beast in Daniel 7, representing Rome. Lots of connections to these bands of iron and brass, aren't there? 15c, in the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, meaning the king would remain out of doors, excluded from the palace. But during the years, the dew of Yahweh's protection would preserve the king so that he could rule his kingdom when his heart was regenerated with a new understanding of sovereignty. For there is hope of a tree if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and the tender branch will not cease. Chapter 4, 15d and 16 apply to the king. Let his portion be with the beast. Most of us know that this meant to and let the king live as the beasts do in the grassy fields. 16a, let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, meaning the king lives contently in nature as do the beast. 16b, let 7 times pass over him. The king will stay in this beast-like condition until he is restored after an appointed period of time. What did Psalm 107:40 predict? He causeth them to wander in the wilderness where there is no way. You know, sometimes Yahweh just lets us wander in the wilderness until we wander right back to him. And you know what else? He always waits for us. 33a. Now more information about the king in verse 33. This is the last verse we're going to look at. Hairs were grown like eagle's feathers. Just as the eagle is king of the birds, so Nebuchadnezzar was still king of Babylon. Daniel 7 represents Babylon as a lion, the king of the beast. That's just an interesting comparison, isn't it? Being king of the birds and the beast. Conclusion on Daniel 4, symbolic language or literal language? What do you think? Is the vision written with symbolic language or literal or all literal language? Here's the conclusion of the matter. There is no symbolic language that would require an interpreter. There is no interpreter sent to explain the meaning of the vision. The king is merely compared to a great tree, as were the kings of Assyria and Egypt. Again, this vision is definitely 100% literal. That's the same conclusion we found for point 1. So a careful study of points number 1 and 2 confirm this vision is literal. And now let's look at point 3. Here, we are going to examine the terms interpretation and application. This is likely going to be new information for you, so I hope you can grasp the concept. I know we're going long, but I want to go ahead and continue so we can get this recorded and upload it, and everyone can go back and pick up where anyone had to leave off. So prophetic key number 20 tells us prophecy written in literal language uses application to align historical events with scripture. Now, what in the world does that mean? Let's try to understand the term interpretation first. In 2 Peter 1:20, it tells us, above all, you must understand that no prophecy of Scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation. Now, let's look at prophetic key number 16 to see what the rule has to say about symbolic interpretation. This is defined as a prophetic word picture of something that is not real. Well, that's easy enough. Webster's 1828 dictionary defines interpretation as to explain the meaning of visions or dreams, to lay open what is not understood. So what does that mean to you and me? Most definitely, Peter is telling us that the Bible will have to give the reader the starting point of the interpretation. We cannot start it. The Bible has to. And that's exactly what happens in Daniel. He always gives the starting point of the interpretation. We never have to guess what it could be. So let's look at some examples. If symbols are involved, the Bible must give us the interpretation until the obvious meaning can be discerned from history, if possible. In Daniel 2, the first symbol was the head of fine gold on the image. Following prophetic key 17, we allowed the Bible to interpret. The Bible decoded the gold head for us in verse 38 when we read, "Thou, Nebuchadnezzar, art this head of gold." Then we made the historical literal application to the king and kingdom of Babylon. So in this application, the gold head represents the first kingdom called Babylon. Those are the steps needed when symbols are present, and they always follow in that order. Babylon scriptural documentation. In Daniel 7, the first beast is a winged lion. Can someone read Daniel 2:36 through 38 there?
This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, the Elohim of heaven, hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold.
Okay, and there's also other reference verses for others to look up as well. So representing the first kingdom of Babylon is the gold head as depicted, because the Bible interprets the prophetic kingdoms. For scriptural documentation, the second kingdom would, if you go, I'm sorry, if you continue to read Daniel 2:39 and Daniel 8:20 and Jeremiah 51:11, please.
And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. Daniel 8:20. The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. Jeremiah 51:11. Yahweh has raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon, to destroy it.
So again, the Bible interprets the prophetic kingdoms, and now we know the silver chest and arms is Medo-Persia, without a doubt. The third kingdom, please continue to read Daniel 2:39 and Daniel 8:21.
And another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. Daniel 8:21. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king.
Okay, so the angel Gabriel also interprets for Daniel the third kingdom of Greece as the goat with a symbolic notable horn. This aligns with the brass belly of the image, and history agrees. These first 3 visions give a few examples of how the Bible interprets symbols. And scriptural documentation in the fourth kingdom, please.
Daniel 2:40. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. Daniel 11:20. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. Luke 2:1. There went out a decree from the Roman Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed.
Okay, so secular history is a second witness, all prophetic kingdoms interpreted through the Bible. In Daniel 11, he described the fourth kingdom as having a raiser of taxes. And yes, we know from the New Testament that this was Caesar Augustus, a Roman. So the Bible has given the interpretation. And when we use historical fact, we give an application to the verses in the vision. So visions that have no symbols with only literal language are different. This is where the term application comes in. Understanding application. Now we need to look at the term application. First of all, we'll review prophetic key number 18. The Bible is to be understood in its most obvious or literal sense, unless a figure or symbol is employed. Remember, similes and metaphors are not the same as symbols. And prophetic key number 20 tells us literal interpretation is used when the prophetic word picture is of something real. Literal events are given application to the word picture. So the definition of application from Webster's 1828 dictionary is principles are applied in a practical way. That's exactly what King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know, how this vision applies to him in a practical way. We know the king didn't understand the vision, so from his point of view, he needed an interpretation. Literal language is also easy to work with. If a vision is written in literal language, then there is no interpretation needed from the Bible itself. Again, let me read that. If a vision is written in literal language, then there is no interpretation needed from the Bible itself. One simply applies secular history fact to the phrases and verses of Scripture. In Daniel 4, a literal tree is compared to a literal king when Daniel says, "The tree that thou sawest, it is thou, O king." He uses a metaphor and application of Ezekiel's prophecy. Daniel merely compares a real tree to a real king, just like Ezekiel did. The king told Daniel the dream, and Daniel gave the king the application of how the dream applied to him. Daniel is establishing a pattern here in chapter 4 because he does the same thing in outline of Daniel 11, the only other vision written with literal language, where historical application is aligned with the individuals and events. Daniel 4 does not need symbolic interpretation because there simply are no symbols. It's just that easy. The word interpretation is used all through chapter 4. In fact, it is used 30 times in Daniel's book. The Strong's definition means to open up or to understand the proper application. Here are two examples. In verse 9, the king says, "Tell me the interpretation," or he wants to know the application that is meant for him. Then in verse 18, he asks Daniel, "Make known unto me the interpretation." Again, he wants to know what the application is and how it will affect his life. The difference between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, Daniel 4 is a literal vision, but Scripture uses the word interpretation when a better term would have been application. So what is the difference between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel? From the king's point of view, he really did need an interpretation, which Daniel gave to him. From Daniel's viewpoint, however, he did not need an interpretation. Okay, so from Daniel's viewpoint, he did not need an interpretation. Using the patterns of fulfilled prophecy from Ezekiel, he merely made practical application of a tree to yet another king, because it had already been done in Scripture before, as we've already shown. He did this by using the historical facts of his day. There was one difference, though. Nebuchadnezzar was restored to his kingdom, unlike the others. Summary. Daniel knew the application. Oh, yes. Daniel knew how the application and how this prophecy applied to the Babylonian king, recorded in verses 19 and 20 and verse 22. My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. Notice Daniel uses the word interpretation when a better term for today would be application, but he is responding in the same terminology as the king. He goes on to say, "The tree that thou sawest, it is thou, O king." The application did not, number one, come through a dream or a vision. Two, it did not come from the angel of Gabriel. Number three, and the application did not need a symbolic interpretation first, like that gold head in Daniel 2 did. The gold head most definitely needed an interpretation. We remember Daniel going back, him and his friends going back and praying to Yahweh to reveal the dream and reveal the interpretation. Remember, Daniel understood Ezekiel's prophecies for the kings of Assyria and Egypt, and he would have known about the prophetic fulfillment for the Pharaoh of Egypt. He simply applied the outcome of these prophecies to King Nebuchadnezzar. No interpreter was needed for this particular dream with the tree. Why? Because this vision uses 100% literal language. So Charlene has hopefully conveyed to us now how to understand the difference between symbolic interpretation and literal application, as this hermeneutic is very important if you want to understand Daniel 11 and 12 correctly. So the concepts are right here. Daniel made sure he established the patterns right here to make it easy for you. So we will be looking at taking a closer look at timelines.